Okay, we're going to finish up with consonants today and then sort of get back into acoustics again and leading into the source filter theory, which we're going to talk about next time. So be sure you've got the notes output for that. So we're going to pick up now with nasals. We've covered plosives already. The rest of the consonants aren't quite as complicated, but they have some acoustic characteristics that we want to be able to relate to physiology. So what is the main thing that is different about nasals compared to all of the other consonants that we produce? Somebody needs to not murmur and press the little button.
The velum is open?
Yeah, the VP port is open. So now we've got potentially two resonating cavities. Okay, you have the oral cavity, but most critically, now you have the nasal cavity coupled to the oral cavity. And that really changes the acoustics quite a bit. When you think about, and I hope you don't do this too often, when you think about the inside of the nasal cavity, what do you picture? Not having a cold. Ordinary non-allergy nasal cavity, not too gunked up. What do you picture in there?
I was going to say like two tunnels.
Two tunnels.
Yeah.
Sounds like kind of sci-fi in the Hobbit hole, right? Okay, I never pictured two tunnels. I guess I could picture a couple tunnels starting here and then they bifurcate and go sort of, the turbinates are a little bit more convoluted. What else besides tunnel-y effect? Yeah.
Open air passage?
If it's not allergy season, it's ideally an open air passage. What kind of tissue is in there, though? Really soft tissue, right? Soft, mushy, acoustically absorbent tissue. It's like having carpet. Well, maybe that's not the best. Foam. It's a lot of soft tissue. And we know that soft tissue absorbs acoustic energy. As opposed, it works just like acoustics in a room. If you have no carpet, no acoustic tiles, hard walls, sound bounces all over the place. It's not absorbed. Here we have acoustic tiles, we have carpet on the floor, and sound is absorbed. So you get less bounce back effect. So the tissues in the nose are like acoustic tiles that tend to absorb a lot of sound, acoustic energy. And so that means that when you're looking at a spectrogram of any nasals, they're never associated with a lot of energy. So this one over here is a spectrogram for the M, remembering that time goes across horizontally, frequency is in the vertical axis. What you have for an M is really, really low frequency, low energy, low acoustic energy. It's not the most powerful sound on the planet. So if I go, it's like, you know, somebody put a gag on me right away, okay? It cuts the energy in half. So part of that is because we're no longer letting acoustic energy out of the mouth. We're relying on all that acoustic energy to just come through the nasal passageway. The N has a little bit different formant structure because the place of occlusion is different. But again, if you look at it compared to the subsequent vowel, you can see that it's still very, very low acoustic energy. Remembering on a spectrogram that it's the bands, the darkness of the bands, that tell you how strong that energy is. So here we're going into an A. We can see the energy for the A is pretty strong compared with the energy in the formants. Or the bands that are associated with the N. Whoops. Is one of the weirdest sounds on the planet. It seems like it should belong to some African click thing or something. So there's not a lot of acoustic energy associated with What's weird about NG in English? I mean, aside from the fact that it's such a strange sound. What else is odd about it?
It's never at the beginning.
Yeah, it's never at the beginning. Can you imagine starting words with I can't. It just doesn't work. Again, you see very, very low frequency energy and not much of it. So one thing that I'd like you to notice is how similar these bands of energy for the nasals look to the pre-voicing, buh, buh. The only difference is that when I'm pre-voicing as something like a buh, I have my VP port closed. Otherwise, it would turn into it would turn into an M. But it's still associated with a low frequency band of energy. So one of the things, what I'd like you to kind of keep in mind is characteristics of sound that will show up on a spectrogram. So when you're thinking about nasals, think about low frequency energy and very little of it. Okay, so if you see a band like this on a spectrogram, you know that it either has to be pre-voicing for a voiced plosive, or else it has to be a nasal. Okay, because there's just not that much energy associated with it. Nasals are also called nasal murmurs, again trying to infer the concept that there's not much energy associated with them. And when you think about nasals and all that acoustic energy absorbed in the nasal passageway, it's easy to see why you kind of lose energy when you're talking like this. It's really, really hard to be very, very loud if you're talking through your nose, because you just lose energy. I can be articulating perfectly fine. I can have a perfectly normal voice. And if everything is channeled through the nasal passageway, like it is in individuals with cleft palate or velopharyngeal incompetence, it's all damped and muffled. Okay, any questions on nasals? All right, fricatives, we've got a bunch of classes of fricatives. And just as a refresher, I know you guys have all had this. Somebody give me an example of a labiodental fricative. Go ahead. Oh, you were just stretching. Okay, somebody else. Yeah. It's an obstacle course.
F or because your lip and your teeth are touching.
Yes. Lower lip and teeth are touching. Oh, it'd be weird to do it the other way around, wouldn't it? If you have an underbite, though, you might actually do that. So F and V are labial dentals. And we're going to go through the energy that's associated with these in just a little bit. How about a lingual dental? Oh, let's back up for just a sec. When you do, like in feel, fine, where are your teeth in relation to your lip? If you say, I'm going there often, or I go there often. Behind it, right. Keep that in mind. There's a huge difference in how we produce sounds contextually and in connected speech than in isolation. And one of the weirdest things that speech pathologists do is to teach inappropriate articulatory contacts, because they're doing it in isolation. So you go, and you put your teeth way over your lip, you act like you're biting the top of your lip off, and it's just wrong. Nobody ever produces it like that in conversational speech, or it would look really, really strange. I go there often. It looks like suddenly I needed to take a bite of something. So keep in mind when you're trying to figure out placement, but especially when you're doing therapy, say it to yourself in contextual, natural speech so that you're not exaggerating things in the wrong way. You know, we don't want to teach over-articulation that's really misplacement of articulators. Okay, so that was F and V. Linguodentals are... I see your tongue. I don't hear a sound. Yeah, TH, voiced and voiceless. So if you say, I'm going to the store, figure out where your tongue is for the. I'm going to the store. Behind, right. So if you're teaching a kid to say, and you have him stick his tongue out 3/4 of the way, he's going to be socially inappropriate. So again, all you're after is the constriction in the right place and air flowing across it. Okay, that you don't have to have exaggerated placement for it to be perceived as a TH. Linguoalveolar. I hear hissing. That's a good sign. Yes. One of the ugliest sounds on the planet. Okay, so we've got S's for lingual alveolar. How about lingual palatal? And then the glottal, so lingual palatal is SH, sh, and the voiced one that doesn't happen very much. And the glottal fricative? Yes. Now, in some languages like French, there's a velar fricative, paré, but we don't do that one. But you sound very, very French if you can. Okay, so fricatives are characterized by their frequency. We know that they're noise, but even though they're noise, they have a concentration of energy in a certain frequency region. And they're characterized by how you make the constriction, whether it's a really broad constriction or really, really narrow constriction, and how much energy is associated with them. Okay, so we'll see similarities across fricatives depending upon those features. So one of the things that can be used to illustrate the frequency concentration of fricatives is considering the effect of articulatory placement, where the tongue is in the mouth. Here we see s, sh, s, sh. And if you just listen to those, s, sh, s, sh, do you hear the frequency difference? S, sh, s, sh. So the S is associated with a much higher frequency. You see here that it is above 4,000 hertz. And you see here that, again, even though it's noise, you have a clear concentration of energy that shifted downward more like around 2,000 hertz. The zh is parallel to the SH. We've just added some voicing to it, which lowers its energy a bit. You can see here, s, z, s, z. We keep the frequency concentration in the same region, but again, we have less acoustic energy associated with it. And if you look kind of carefully, you can almost see some vertical striations in there representing voicing. You can also see that here. It just looks a little bit more organized when you have a voiced component to the fricative than without it. So when we think about frequency in general in acoustics, a good rule of thumb is if it's a small space, it's a high frequency. Okay, so little spaces give you high frequencies. Small things give you high frequencies. So if you picture a little tinkly silver bell versus a big Buddha gong, okay, you know the little tinkly bell is going to be high frequency and the big Buddha gong is going to be very, very low. Same thing with spaces. A small amount of space gives you very high frequency. Larger spaces give you low frequency. So think large and low. High and small don't really work, but if someone can think of a mnemonic, that'd be great. So here, often with acoustics, we think of the space in front of the constriction. And it's usually the space in front of the constriction, wherever the articulatory contact is made or approximated, that determines what the frequency of the sound is going to be. So if I go s, s, it has very little space in front of the constriction, and it's going to be a high frequency sound. If I move the articulatory position back going s, sh, you can hear the frequency lower. There's more space in front of the constriction, and that's what makes it a lower frequency sound. Okay, so small space, high frequency, and the space that matters when you're getting ballpark for frequency is the space in front of the constriction. So here we can see the effect of the constriction moving forward. So if I'm making a sound that we don't have in English, that's like a palatal, mid-palatal fricative. That's hard to do because I was keeping my tongue tip too pointy. If any of you can do this better than I can, hiss away. The further back it is, the more space there is in front, and the lower and the higher the frequency will be as it moves forward. So somebody was able to do a soft palate fricative to mid palate to alveolar ridge, and you can see that the frequency concentration of the noise increased as they did so. You can hear it if you do it in isolation. So if I'm doing a palatal fricative, not like the French one, but so a soft palate fricative has a lower frequency to it. Okay, so let's talk about how much energy there is and where the energy is concentrated. So if I'm going, which one's stronger? Yes, you're all hissing appropriately. The S is stronger, right? S is associated with narrow constriction as opposed to an F and a V where the constriction is really, really broad. So the constriction for an F or a V, even though we're not really biting our lip, is certainly the teeth along the entire lip. So it's a very broad rather than a narrow constriction. When there's a broad constriction, it tends to diffuse the energy, and you end up with lower energy, or essentially a softer sound, than you do with a narrow constriction. Okay, so broad constriction sounds like F and V are going to be low energy. You picture all that air being diffused across the lips as opposed to being channeled in a really, really tight little space. Okay, and that broad constriction decreases the energy. So F and V's, because of their broad constriction, have low energy. Because of the position in the mouth. Now, they don't follow that rule about in the area in front of the constriction very well. A lot of people believe that with sounds that are associated with labials, that you essentially have the whole vocal tract resonating. Otherwise, would think that F and V should be a high-pitched sound, right? But because there's really teeny tiny little space in front of them. But instead, because the lips are associated with it, you end up with the whole vocal tract resonating. And big space lowers the frequency. Okay, so they don't quite follow as logically as the other sounds for the frequency concentration. So now look at, this would work for the voice TH as well. How much difference do you hear between Not much. Again, really broad constriction. The tongue is essentially making, well, approximating a constriction with the teeth whole way across, not just the tip of the tongue. The tongue blade tends to be kind of flat. Again, low frequency energy because we've got the whole vocal tract resonating, not much in front of it. What's a really, really, really common sound substitution in certain dialects and in little kids? That's related to what we're talking about. Yeah?
The F for TH?
F for TH. If I say birthday, birthday, you hear much difference? Birthday, birthday. It's a brilliant substitution. It's a perfect substitution. No one's even going to hardly notice it.
So would they look the same on a graph where you couldn't tell which
They look a little bit differently, but not much. You'd need to be one of those expert people who spends way too much time looking at spectrograms to figure it out. So we go by context. But one thing as you're working with kids as a speech pathologist, one thing that matters is, do the articulatory errors that the child makes make sense? And an F for TH makes perfect sense. So the kids got the concept of acoustically, what should this sound like? And they're just producing it a little bit differently. But they're really, really close in terms of the acoustic output. I would much rather have that kind of substitution than a kid who stops a fricative, which means you're in an entirely different sound class completely. Go ahead.
I know a little girl who says, instead of brother, she says bruvder. Is that stopping a fricative? So,
yeah, but she's got the right idea because she has a V before it. So she's on the idea that there should be some frication there, but then she just put the plosive in there. So that one wouldn't be necessarily very hard to fix. It's when they don't have the concept of manner that I worry more about it. Not that I worry, I don't work with kids, but conceptually I would worry about it. So I want you to notice the similarity between the broad constriction sounds and how acoustically they're very, very reasonable to substitute for each other. Okay, S and Z. I would like to eliminate S from the English language. I think it is the most obnoxious sound in the world. It disrupts any music. I remember, now that looking back, this made me realize that I really was destined to do what I do. I remember when I was a little kid in church, listening to the Our Father and thinking how horrible it sounded, which is totally sacrilegious, of course. Our Father who art in heaven, in the kingdom, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. The whole church hissed. It's all you heard. You felt like some Job and the snakes or something. It was horrible. So it's really a high frequency, high intensity, nasty sound. I almost prefer like lisping because it has that broad frequency energy, and it reduces it. So the couple of things that make the S really obnoxious are it's a tiny space for air to go through. So you have a really narrow constriction. If you can't do a teeny tiny little tongue tip groove, your S's aren't going to sound good. The narrowness of the constriction is what really, really focuses the energy and makes it such a high energy kind of sound. And S is really, really obvious anywhere you're listening. So if you're trying to go undercover, you want to do a TH for S substitution so people don't hear you. I'm reading techno thrillers lately. So it's high frequency energy because you have a small space in front of the constriction, which increases the frequency. So if you think about that, then the TH for S substitution, does that make as much sense as the F for TH substitution? Why not? They're not close enough in terms of sound. So if you have a child who's doing a TH for S substitution, what are you going to suspect? Number one, it's still okay. The class of sound is all right because they're still doing fricatives, right? So TH for S at least has the right manner of production. Go ahead.
High frequency loss, hearing.
Oh, that probably wouldn't be the conclusion I'd jump to, but that's a possibility. You would have screened the kid for hearing before you're jumping to conclusions. Hard rock musician listener.
No, just really bad surgery when he was a kid.
Seriously? And ended up with a high frequency hearing loss?
He had a rigid stapes bone, and so they went in there to put a pedestal, and they ended up knocking the whole thing off. So it's really, really fun because he's an excellent lip reader, so I could just, lip read, and so, yeah. But then when he's drunk, it just comes out th-th-th-th-th, and so it's really fun.
Okay, so high frequency hearing loss you do want to rule out. Why do you think some little kids do the TH for S? Go ahead.
Is it easier tongue placement for TH?
It's certainly not as precise tongue placement. The TH, you've got broad, shoot, I can hit the blade of my tongue against my teeth, that's a piece of cake. That teeny tiny narrow little groove, teeny tiny, shoot, sound Lee Dixon. Teeny tiny little grooves, hard to do. So motorically it's more difficult for the child to produce that. So, if you guys do this in connected speech, the Sally sells seashells by the sandy seashore, not exactly connected speech, go ahead and do it without thinking and tell me where your tongue is. How many of you have your tongue tip going up? Can I assume the rest of you have it going down, or you haven't figured it out? How many of you know your tongue tip goes down? Really? Can I hear it? No, I need it with the little thingy on. Yeah, right. You have to produce your S in public.
Sally sells shells by the seashore.
Okay. Did you hear her S? Try it once more. A little bit louder.
Sally sells seashells by the seashore.
How's it sound? You guys all should be saying perfectly fine. Okay? So you can produce an acoustically perfect S with the tongue tip down instead of up. So that means try it. Where are you producing, how are you producing that little teeny constriction if you do that? Go ahead.
Your teeth get more involved, don't they?
Your teeth get more involved.
In the constriction
Like
of the air.
Venus flytrap. Well, the teeth do add to the turbulence of the S. That's true.
Is it you're putting there under your tongue? You're blowing it from under your tongue instead?
No, I don't think you can do that. No, that would almost make it a lateral S. Lateral S is like this. Sally picked sandy seashells by the sandy seashore. So that means that my tongue tips up and the air is coming out the side. That's one of the uglier S's you can produce. But if you're doing the S with the tongue tip down, you do get a groove, but the tongue has to be positioned differently. So the very, very middle of the tongue is where the air is shooting through. It's a little bit trickier because you don't have the tip up, but certainly you can produce an acceptable S that way. And you wouldn't hear any differences acoustically. So what's one of the things that sometimes happens with S's with older people? Go ahead.
They get whistly.
They can be whistly. I wanted to show you videos. The creepy old guy on Family Guy. I couldn't. They were too obnoxious. But the creepy old guy on Family Guy does a brilliant whistly S. And I can't do one. I think I might have done one once in my life by accident. But if you want an example of an S that truly whistles, he does them. Okay, any questions on S's? Yeah.
Do people get therapy for holding out their S's too long? Like people that at one point someone told me it's called a sibilant S, but that doesn't make sense. It's like those people that are just really hissy and they hold things out for a really long time.
It's more of a personality defect. I honestly have never heard about that. There are some people who are overly precise. And I think they may be inclined to exaggerate the duration of sounds as well as the precision. That would be my guess. It certainly is. I didn't say they had to be your friend. Yes.
My mom has done voiceovers for different
Cool.
like animated things, and she said the hardest thing for her to do voiceovers was whenever she made high frequency sounds, she would have to turn her head real quick, and so she'd be shaking her head the whole time she was talking. But
Right.
she said after a while it becomes natural, but it drove the techs crazy whenever she spoke with a high frequency sound into the microphone.
Did she ever try just moving further away from the mic?
That's what they had told her to do. That was their strategy, was
Oh,
to
man.
tilt your mouth just a little bit away from the microphone.
That's hard to do, especially because S's occur so often. Jeez. But they can overdrive acoustic systems. I would have thought those guys would be able to set it up better, though.
Well, I think most of the things she does are like kind of indie, so they
Yeah.
don't have all the fancy equipment to do.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Did you guys see the video of Chocolate Rain? It's a very strange one. It's a guy who has a really, really, really exaggerated low voice. And every time he breathes, he turns his head away from the microphone, and the subtitle is, "I'm breathing, I didn't want it to be heard." So he's going, "Chocolate rain," and then he breathes. But breathing can be an ugly sound. If you don't want to hear the noise of inspiration, it's fine to do that. Okay. So that's S and Z. So SH has a somewhat different constriction. It's a little bit broader Well, it's quite a bit broader than the S, but it is not as broad as THs and Fs and Vs. What else is impacting, what else do you think is impacting the frequency of SH? Not just the location of the constriction in the mouth. What else is? Yeah. Not necessarily. What else? Go s, sh, s, sh, s, sh. What do your lips do? Your lips round. Yeah. So you've got lip rounding. What's lip rounding going to do to the space in front of the constriction? Increase it. What's that going to do to the frequency? Lower it. More space, lower frequency. So you've got two things contributing to the lower, somewhat lower frequency of SH compared to S. The tongue constriction is a little bit further back, and you've added area because of the lip rounding. So H is one of the stranger ones. It doesn't really have a constriction. It's just air going through the entire vocal tract. Typically low frequency because the entire vocal tract is acting as the resonator. And it's also low energy. It's hard to make a loud H. A lot of singers tend to skip it in songs. They just don't say H's. I don't know if it's because it uses too much air or what their difficulty is with H, but it's a sound that you often hear just omitted. Any questions about fricatives? So what I'd like you to know is the type of constriction, whether it's broad or narrow, how that affects the energy, whether it's a strong sound or a weak sound, and then what is it that determined the frequency. So is it a relatively high frequency sound or a relatively low frequency sound? So remember, the labial fricatives are going to have the entire vocal tract resonating, so those are going to be typically lower frequency sounds. And the highest frequency one is the S. Okay, so the ones that we're going to go on to now are a little bit more vowel-like. Wa and ya are the glides that we're going to talk about. And one of the things that I wanted you to see with the wa sound is the importance of the transition, moving to the following vowel. So this is a spectrogram of B, we, and oo-e, oo-e. So B, of course, has virtually no transition. You see here the occlusion. It's moving right into the E. The W has a gradual transition. We, relatively quick. Here is the start of the W, and if you do it slowly, you've got lip rounding because of the oo component of it. That's why it starts off at a low frequency here, because lip rounding lowers all the frequencies in the vocal tract. And then it's moving up to the E. And here, if you actually separate the sounds and do oo-ee, oo-ee, you can see that the pattern is really similar here. So this would be the first band of energy here is called the first formant, because now we're sort of moving into vowel-like sounds. Vowels are described by where the formants are, where the bands of energy are. Here you see a quick transition to the formant characteristic of an E, which is a really, really low first formant, a really, really high second formant. That's why we've got this big space in here. And then here, when you stretch out the oo part of the we, you have a low concentration of energy because the lip rounding lowered everything. And then it slides on up to the position for the E. Okay, so here we've got the sort of classic separation between the first formant and the second formant for the E. You can hardly see where the transient burst is for the release of the B. And here you have the lip rounding affecting the initial energy and then going to the E. And here you have a really exaggerated oo, where you see the low concentration of energy in terms of frequency, and then it splits for the E. So with glides, what matters is how quickly do you move through the sounds. B, we, we. Okay, so you might hear we as just an exaggerated W, or you might hear it as ooh, E. Okay, but the more natural one is going to have a much briefer ooh part to it, we. So glides, you're simply moving from one vowel to another vowel. Yeah.
So on a spectrogram, if you were to have pre-voicing for the W, would it look like the ooh one?
Well, you really only think about pre-voicing as something that happens with plosives. But you're right, the ooh-wee kind of looks like pre-voicing to me. It's so much of an exaggeration. But what you would have with pre-voicing really could only occur here, and it would be before the release of the B. But anytime there's exaggeration, I can see why you kind of thought of pre-voicing, because it sounds like that. Yeah.
Could you repeat your definition for formant?
Yeah, a formant is a concentration of energy in a certain range of frequencies. And almost always, you could say virtually always, formants are associated with vowels or with sounds that are like vowels. That's why we see them with the glides. So they're concentrations of energy in a certain frequency region, and they're associated with vowels or vowel-like sounds. So they look like the dark bands on the spectrogram. Now next time we'll get into why those bands look dark. It's an area where energy passed through the vocal tract really easily. Those frequencies made it through easily. But you can see that it's kind of a thick region here. This isn't a straight line going across here. It's really, maybe 200 hertz, 250 hertz worth of frequencies. So it's a band of frequency. They typically are maybe around 250 hertz or so in width. So this frequency region for the first formant of oo is probably from about 1 hertz to 250 hertz. Okay, because that's the band of frequencies that made it through the vocal tract easily. Okay? So the other glide is a ya. And this is a contrast between a ya and a wa. So the low band is the first formant, and then the bands go up. The formant numbers go up as you go up in frequency. So here's the first formant, here's the second formant, and here's the third formant. Okay, so sometimes it's abbreviated as F1, F2, and F3. So the way to see the contrast between sounds that are kind of similar is to look across the formant. So here we see formant 1 for a yacht. Whoops. And it goes, there's the there's the y, the constriction for the ya, and into the and here you see release of the t. And here is a watt. and we've got the low F1 here, same swoop downward, going here, and this time there's even more aspiration on the release of the T. Okay? So what would you say about the similarity between the first and the second formants on, I'm sorry, between the first formants on wa and ya? Do they look really different, or do they look kind of similar? Yeah, they seem pretty similar. If you would show someone just the first formant for ya and wa, they wouldn't be able to tell you which one it is. So to distinguish between the two, we need to bring in the second formant. And you can see the second formant acts really, really, really differently between the two of them. A yacht. Here, you've got a really, really high second formant. So if you go and do the sound ya, what part of it gives you that really high second formant? Ya. What's that sound like? Ya. What vowel is it? E. You've got it basically an E vowel. So we know that an E vowel has really, really low first formant, really, really high second formant. So that's why on this ya, you've got this thing swooping up to here, because essentially it's reaching the second formant that's associated with an E. Okay, so you've got a vowel-like sound. It's going to look like the vowel, except it's more dynamic. To make glides, you've got to move from one articulatory position to another. Okay, so that's why this looks so swoopy. So here, right at this point, is where the person is really saying more like an E than anything else. But it's moving to and from that E that gives the ya quality to the sound. So here we've got the schwa, and here we've got moving down for the F1 for the E and moving way up for the F2 for the E. And then moving back to the position for the formants of an ah. In this one, we almost lose the second formant. It's almost running right into the first formant. So if I'm doing a wat, what sound is that lowering of F2 associated with it? Where am I in that glide? A wat. Yes, the ooh. So basically what you're looking at is the formants associated with an ooh sound. Now if you do ooh kind of exaggerated, you definitely have lip rounding on it. I went to see Les Miserables the other night. Do you guys know the show? It's one of the most depressing shows on the planet. And they sing everything. Yeah. I went because we're studying the child who had the boy lead in Les Miserables. And he did great. But I had to listen to everybody else just to listen to him. And they did oohs really, really strangely. Most singers will do ooh, where you hear like, you still have your jaw kind of lowered. They did ooh, ooh. It was like ooh. It was awful. It was like these really, really highly trained people, and they just did ooh in the middle of songs. It was the strangest thing. And I don't know why they exaggerated it that way. It was a very, very odd sound. But that lip rounding, especially an exaggerated lip rounding, what does it do to the length of the vocal tract? Yeah, it increases the length of the vocal tract. And you've got more space in front of the constriction, and it shifts everything downward. Ooh has the lowest F1 and F2 of any vowels because of the increased vocal tract length. So that's why you see the F2 kind of disappear into this. So if I were static and just holding that ooh what before I move to and from it, essentially what you're seeing is an ooh sound here. So what you're looking at when you do ya wa is not just the transitions to and from the glide, but really the target sounds that they come from, the E and the oo. Okay? And that explains why F2 goes way up in ya, because really it's the E, and why it goes way down in oo in the wa, because really it's the oo. Okay? So keep in mind that if you're making the distinction between ya and wa, that it's F2 that's going to make the difference. Okay? Otherwise they're going to look the same. The other thing to keep in mind is that in order to perceive the sound as a glide, it has to be moving at the right pace. You have to be making that transition in a way that fits your speaking rate. Otherwise it's going to sound like two separate vowels. Okay, so glides are moving from one sound to the other. And our ear expects it to be at a certain rate. Questions on ya and wa?
We were talking about what determines frequency. I kind of got a little confused. So that means the length of the vocal tract determines the frequency?
Yeah, it's jumping a little bit ahead. But when we talk about formants and how the formants have certain frequency regions associated with them, it really is the length of the vocal tract.
And that, like, if you had a K, it would be shorter than like an S where it's farther, the tongue is farther up. I was trying to get that concept, or is that don't need to
I
get
probably
that?
shouldn't have mentioned lip rounding.
S is really a long vocal tract, right? Or
No, the S issue is the area in front of the constriction, which is small. So if you're looking at the plosives, try and most of the time, what's going to determine the frequency of these kinds of sounds is the area in front of the constriction. Okay, and that kind of works for this because what lengthened the vocal tract with oo was lip rounding, which is still in front of the constriction. Okay, so you can even hear a difference if you listen carefully. K, t, k, t, k. The k, even though it's noise, has a lower frequency associated with it than t, because there's more area in front of the constriction with the k. So sometimes you just need to play with the sounds. Usually you can hear the frequencies. You just have to be willing to play them to yourself. Okay, so liquids are L and R. And liquids to be perceived differently from each other. That distinction between R and L, which is so difficult for some speakers of Asian languages to learn in American English. The difference is actually made by F3, which doesn't often come into play. So when we get to vowels, we'll see that all we need to perceive vowels accurately is the first and second formant. For us to hear the difference between an R and an L, we really need to see, or rather perceive, F3. So here we've got the F1 for the rabbit, So what else am I doing with this besides that funky place where my tongue is? Lip rounding for the rabbit too. Okay, so we've got the frequency is depressed a bit because of lip rounding, so things are swooping low. Here they came from the low position. The rabbit ran down the road. You can see the depression in F1, F2, and F3 often doesn't have a lot of energy associated with it. But we need it for the R sound. The L is a really strange sound. And it's strange because if you look at it, it doesn't have a lot of acoustic energy associated with it. And one of the reasons for that is it's an odd concept, and I don't want you to worry about it. I just want you to know it exists. When you have your tongue up and acoustic energy is coming out the sides, like it does in it creates something called antiformants. Sounds like you ought to make a bad movie out of it, right? The antiformants. And the antiformants actually essentially cancel out energy of other formants. Okay, so you end up with, again, low energy sound here. because there's just not a lot of acoustic energy coming forward in the mouth. If the only place that acoustic energy can come out is the sides, it's hitting your cheeks, which is going to absorb it. So L is just kind of an odd sound all around. What's a common substitution for L? Oh, the ya. Yellow, yellow. That's not a good one to do it on. Yo. Yeah. Yips. Do people say that? You said yips for lips. Oh, that's cute. See, those are the ones you don't want to change in a child. Yeah.
I think, too, it also depends on where in the word it is, because it could be a W or a Y.
No, that's a really good point, because some dialects in different parts of the countries do really, really strange L's. So where I'm from in Pennsylvania, people do what are called dark L's, where it's almost like you're swallowing your tongue. So fall, all. There's no tongue tip up. I'm just choking myself. So some dialects have variations on the L that really does show up. I like yip a lot. When my son was little, he sped everything perfectly, except he had a T for K substitution that lasted till he was 5.5. So this perfectly articulate kid. And then if he wanted to say quick, he'd go twit, twit. I just loved that one. I was so sorry when the twit went away. Okay, so for L's, think about a loss of energy because of just the way it's shaped. You lose acoustic energy. And for the R's, keep in mind that you need the F3 to make you hear that it's actually an R sound. Whoops. So here's an example of the contrast. And this is a rot and a lot. Here we have the downward. The thing to really, really look at is, again, this swoopiness. But here you have the swoopiness in F3. And this is what's going to perceptually give you the difference between the R and the L. So look at F1. Here's the F1 for R. Here's the F1 for L. Here's the F2 for R. Here's the F2 for L. If you just see those, it'd be really hard to tell one from the other. And then you get to F3 and you see this huge swoop downward for the R, and for the L, F3 is straight across. Okay, so that's one of the reasons that it's such a difficult sound. F3 is produced by some interaction among the placements of the placement of the articulators in the vocal tract. It's not an easy thing to teach. So for the LR contrast, you have to have the third formant to be able to distinguish them. Okay, questions on? Yes?
With all these spectrograms, should we teach ourselves how to identify which sound we're seeing for the final exam? Will we be responsible for that?
Only in the most extreme cases. So I might ask you if something is an R versus an L, and because it would be really, really exaggerated swoop for the F3. I would probably ask you to distinguish between a voiceless versus a voiced plosive. But I'd never ask you to tell me which plosive it is. Okay? And when we get to vowels, I would expect you to be able to distinguish among them because they look really different. But the way I do it, and you will probably see this on the final, I would actually draw the spectrogram because I don't trust it to be obvious enough with real ones. So the part that you're looking for would be really, really obvious. Okay? So just know the concept and kind of why that occurs. I'd never ask you to tell the difference between an M or an N. You just can't. But if you see a low energy bar and it's leading right into vowels with no obvious spike, it has to be a nasal rather than a plosive. Okay? So it will be only big, big differences. But what I care more about is that you can relate what you would see or hear acoustically to how you're producing it. That's really the part that matters. And then thinking about it in terms of common sound substitutions and why they either work or why they don't work. You can think of that in terms of foreign accents. You can think of it in terms of developing articulation in kids. Some substitutions are okay and some are just not. And it usually has to do with the similarities of the acoustic characteristics of the sounds that are being exchanged. Okay?
So what will determine the frequency is basically the space in front of the constriction. What was the other one?
Well, we mentioned the length of the vocal tract, but for right now, you're probably better off for the consonants just thinking about the space in front of the constriction. So when we get to vowels, it's the length of the vocal tract that really matters. Okay? But we're going to get to that next time. Okay? All right. Have a good afternoon, guys.